Hi, and welcome to Ren in Focus, a podcast brought to you by the Radicalization Awareness Network. My name is Morgenstern, and today I'll be talking to frontline practitioners and experts about gender dynamics of the far right and Islamist extremism, and how we as practitioners can counter this. So there are two sides to this discussion, whether it's women being used to kind of lure converts into the far right or ISIS directly appealing to women to help form a caliphate. We'll be looking at how gender can be weaponized and really used as a point of polarization. And then, of course, there's the obsession with gender and masculinity and things like the incel movement. And the other thing we will be discussing is the need to recognize and work with gender in the PCVE world, and really how this can make our work as practitioners more effective. Our first guest for the day is Catherine Brown. She is a professor at the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham and has written books and papers for RAN and other various organizations on the gender dimensions of countering violent extremism and what this actually means for practitioners. So, without further ado, hi Catherine. So Catherine, you've been working on gender-related topics for about 20 years now, which is a long time, but it has just recently become a much more talked about topic. Why is that?
Part of this is recent concerns over the so-called Islamic State, so Daesh, who were unusually successful in recruiting women. And what we have tended to find in the past is that right-wing and religious extremist groups tend to have lower levels of women as members and even lower levels of women as members within the leadership roles.
In what way were they effective and unique in their approach to gender?
For example, Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, were really good at highlighting the gaps, actually, in European society in terms of what it promises women. They were saying, well, hold on a minute, women don't really get equal pay. They're not protected from male violence. Look at the rape culture that's going on. Women's roles as mothers are not really protected or valued. And then they started to create a different gender ideology that really kind of twisted those kinds of gaps in our society and saying, we have a different gender solution. Now, it's one I disagree with, but that's what they were able to do as well at the group level.
And of course, many of these women are now returning from Iraq and from Syria, for example. How do we as practitioners work with gender in the de-radicalization process?
So there are a couple of challenges for practitioners. The first one is recognizing that in the de-radicalization process, we often obsess over how did someone get into the extremist group. And I think that there is a tendency here to either place women as 100% as victims. So either they were groomed or seduced or they were forced into it. Or they are somehow the most evil people ever because they've taken their children and completely bought into ISIS ideology and they're just complete villains in this story. Whereas the experiences of women joining are shaped both by what I would consider as limited agency because of their gender, but also the second problem we have as practitioners is that we have very little third-party evidence of their activities while they're in Iraq and Syria. And this causes problems because it introduces a level of doubt about the women's narratives. Because unsurprisingly, the majority of women will try to minimize their participation, and they'll also try and minimize the violence that they've experienced or seen or participated in. And also related to that then is the third part is their journey towards leaving the group. So there's been some criticism of some of the women saying, oh, you only left when things started to go wrong. Well, yes, right? Because up until that point, for some of the women, life was actually pretty easy. Pretty good. And that's hard for us to hear because at the same time as their life being okay, we had ISIS committing horrific crimes. And some of their life being okay is at the expense of other human beings. So there's a real tension there. But then things started to go bad and they started to question why they were there. And that's not an unreasonable thing to do when suddenly your experience doesn't match what you're being told. Right, that say-do gap. But we need to work with that, not just dismiss it. And the other thing with the exit process is that for many of the women now, and during the chaos of Daesh collapsing, they have now been subject to significant abuse. So we need to be, as practitioners, very mindful that many of them won't feel comfortable talking about some of that abuse. They won't feel comfortable talking about what's happening to them in the camps right now. And that's going to take some time.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this. I feel like I could carry on for hours.
So could I, as you've imagined, because I'm still talking, I could keep on talking. It's fine.
Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.
My pleasure, Maya.
Talking to Catherine, I think my main takeaway is what she said about that we really need to be aware of our own gender assumptions. And also in relation to being culturally aware and not letting our own cultural assumptions really take over and affect the way we work. Our second guest is Evian Leibig, and she is a research fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism, with her research specifically focusing on women in the far right and gendered narratives of recruitment, radicalization, and propaganda. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi.
So first of all, what role do women play in the radicalization and recruitment processes in the far right, and how has that role changed and developed in recent times?
When it comes to gender narratives that are promoted by far-right women, particularly online, it's often, about narratives of sisterhood when they're trying to recruit and radicalize young women. It's about telling them that if you join us, you'll find a sisterhood of like-minded women like ourselves. And that traditionalism, so asserting your natural femininity, is something that provides a true happiness for them.
And is the role of gender any different in the recruitment process offline?
These influencers will talk about their personal experiences of being unhappy, of being deeply depressed, and that is all experiences that originate from offline. It's about their lifestyles and their choices. But then it's online in which they find or can translate those personal grievances into a community and into an ideology of shared values, shared norms, etc. So in my mind, it's really difficult to separate both the online and the offline. I think they're so interconnected.
Can you tell me a bit more about the different roles that women actually play in the radicalization process?
What I found in my research is that women are recruiters and propagandists. They're also organizers and fundraisers. Something that I was a bit surprised about is I assumed that most women in the far right would be recruiting primarily other women into the far right. And what I actually found is that they're mostly recruiting men into the far right, which sort of beckons, are these women just essentially honey traps for young men into the far right? So just to sidetrack on a little example here, there was a young man named Philip Manshus who attempted to carry out an attack at a mosque outside of Oslo in 2019. And Manshus was an avid fan of the Christchurch shooter and displayed National Socialist views. And during the trial, Manshus had revealed that he held National Socialist views, deeply anti-Semitic and racist attitudes. But something that was left out of the media coverage of the trial was the fact that shortly before carrying out the attack, Manshus became an avid viewer of a prominent far-right female activist. And he became obsessed with the idea of finding a wife, having white children, and settling down in the Norwegian countryside as a consequence of watching this female far-right activist content. So it can be quite revealing the very dangerous effects that these women can have, inspiring young men like Manshus to commit political violence and terrorist atrocities.
So Evian, you've certainly given us so much more to think about now, and some really good insights into culture that many of us won't be aware of or haven't been aware of until now. So thank you, Evian, so much for joining us today. So talking to Evian, I think my main takeaway is the importance of really just educating myself, and we have to educate ourselves and everyone that's really working with young people in this new generation. We really have to get involved in this kind of new culture, this influencer culture, and we really have to be in that space in order to combat it. So we've really been talking about female-related issues until now, but of course gender also plays a huge role in men's experience of violent extremism. Our final guest for the day is an expert in gender-related issues from a male perspective in countering violent extremism, Christian Morgenstern.
Hi, Maya.
So can you describe the hyper-masculine nature of that is a big part of the violent right-wing extremism or extremist group? I'm thinking Proud Boys and also the veneration of male body fitness and stuff like that.
Hypermasculinity, or like traditional masculinity, or in air quotes, correct masculinity, is this idea of a man's man that we have spent the last 15, 20 years being gender fluid, trying to redefine the gender roles and so on, which has led some people to look for a extremely masculine ideal, like the super soldier, He-Man, Arnold Schwarzenegger, early 80s, kind of type of male role model. You know, the guy who will be one with nature, who will go out and kill his own meat, and he definitely eats meat, no tofu, and like, he can shoot a gun and not play the guitar. Like, just a prototypical pseudo-masculine idea of what it means to be a man. Like, you know, the kind of type of guy who drinks his coffee black, no sugar.
And in what way is this nature a part of the violent right-wing narrative?
Like, the baseline narrative of the male role model as a protector is an idea that is at the foundation of the right-wing movement, that men need to become manly men. And that's also why it works. Like, there's this idea of a romantic call to arms. Like, we need to be a band of brothers. We need to stand shoulder to shoulder and be ready to repel the attacking hordes.
Could you see this as like kind of a reaction to feminism? It's obviously completely different, and it's a completely different side of the spectrum. But is it? Could you say that it's a reaction?
Yeah, definitely. The notion, the idea of the hypermasculine male is a reaction out of fear to what some people think that feminism wants to turn the man into. Like, the conspiracy theory shared in these circles is that all the evil feminists want to have the men eat tofu and take up crochet instead of hunting and make them less masculine so that the feminists can overthrow them and take the power. And therefore, they feel a need to install this notion of hypermasculinity to fight back against feminism.
Yeah, and the enemy is women, I assume, in this case.
Well, the evil enemy is either the strong women, the feminists, or the powerful women that want to allow the secondary enemy, the typically Muslim immigrants, entry into their countries. So it's both women, but more women as a gatekeeper, feminists as a gatekeeper to a super enemy behind them.
And is there a group of men that are like extra vulnerable to becoming radicalized in this way?
Well, what we typically see is that the men who are vulnerable to this sort of rhetoric are those who are seeking an explanation. Like, why am I unhappy? Why am I jobless? Why am I not satisfied in my life? Either you can answer all those questions by saying, I made some wrong choices, or you can externalize them and bite this very palpable, edible explanation that it's someone else's fault. And it's a very convenient train of thought to be told, well, if not for feminists, then there would be jobs for you. If not for Muslim men that come into our countries and have sex with all of our women, there would be a mate or a wife for you. So it's typically, we do see unhappy men being at risk of drinking the Kool-Aid or joining some of these communities. But it's not only them, it's also powerful, resourceful men that just view these communities as a place to gain traction, to gain power, and sometimes even for an economic benefit.
So you've written about the connection between mental health issues and some of the gender-oriented, violent right-wing ideologies. Can you please explain this a little to me?
But typically it's the other way around. If you have a mental illness or vulnerability, it can sometimes be hard for you to find access to some physical communities, social communities in high school or universities. So you have a higher risk to be left on the outside, become vulnerable, become lonely, and then you're at risk to join some of these communities.
So do you think we as practitioners need to educate ourselves in like social media literacy, social media training in general, and gaming language? Is this a part of like the key to solve this or to work with this issue?
Yes, to a certain degree. Like this is a language that some of these kids just speak fluently and from a very early age. But as a professional, as a practitioner, you're always welcome to reach out to digital experts such as myself, because my expertise is not in PCVE work. My expertise, my background is in screens rather than people. So use some of the entry-level information campaigns that are out there, and like there's a lot of good stuff out there. So you don't need to become a hyper nerd overnight.
So, Christian, thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope to speak to you soon.
Cool. Anytime.
As practitioners, we're constantly evolving, and we have to kind of follow, the current discussion and the current events. And gender is a huge topic right now. And in order to talk about gender, I think we have to become aware of how the gender assumptions and gender stereotypes affect us. And how it really affects the way we work in every PCV work or aspect. I think that's super important. Thank you to all of my guests for speaking to me today and to really discussing this important and very, very relevant topic. And I hope this becomes more of a frequent discussion in every PCV area. And thank you to you all for listening. And I really hope you can join me in the next episode of Ran in Focus.